So calling a parents function inside of a child component within React is probably one of the first tricky things that a junior developer will come across when learning React. So in this tutorial we're going to create a simple photo voting app that has various different network requests to actually get the data and update the data when the user tries to upvote a photo. And you can see how you call a function in a parent component from a child component when the user clicks to upvote a photo. So let's take a look at the app and start coding.
Okay, so before we get started, let's have a little demo of the app that we're going to be building. So it's very straightforward really. We're just going to be generating some placeholder images, and if you actually hover over the image and then click on it, you can see we've got a number of upvotes which increases with every click that goes onto the actual image. So the cool thing about this is that it's actually persisted into a database, so the images are generated from the database and the upvotes are saved in there as well. And this isn't a local storage on the browser, it's actually a database outside. And I'll explain a little bit about that in just a second. So when we're actually clicking to increase the upvote, the network request is being sent to an API, which is in turn updating the database. So as I mentioned, the main point of the tutorial was to see how we can send those kind of requests directly within components, and also to how to trigger effects that are outside of the component, as the main app component is responsible for loading the images and then updating the data associated with them. Okay, so I'll just give you a quick overview of the server itself. It's nothing too complicated. There's just an express server setup with two endpoints, and the first is just to get all of the images, and the second is to upvote an image. And the data is stored in a local SQLite database. And the reason I went for that is just so that the database will be included in the project. So if you want to clone the project from GitHub and follow along, then all you need to do is install the dependencies, and you don't need to worry about setting up an external database. Okay, so just to illustrate the database itself, so here we have a browser for SQLite. So if we just open the database for this particular project, you can see it's dead simple. We've got all of these IDs here, which represent the images that have been displayed, and then we've got a count of the upvotes that are there. So using Postman, we can test this out. So if we just go to localhost 3000 and images is the first endpoint, you can see it returns a list of images in JSON format with the number of upvotes associated. And so the second endpoint works by sending a patch request. So if we want to upvote a particular image, we grab its ID, in this case 11, and then we send that patch request. We get a status back to say everything was okay. And if we send another GET request to the images endpoint, you can see the upvotes for ID of 11 have been updated. And then if we go back to the app, you'll see when we refresh the page this time, a new network request is sent, and now the upvotes for the first image have been increased to 9. Okay, so that's enough of the setup. Let's actually get coding. So if you've cloned the GitHub repository, if you just go over to the setup branch, that should reset the project to a basic bit of React boilerplate. So we'll have a component which will contain the image, and then there'll be a further component in there just to display the image as well. But first of all, a good place to start would be to actually retrieve the image data itself. So let's work on that using a use effect hook. Let's create a function to actually do the retrieving first of all. So retrieve images is the function name, and it will be an async function. So we can use the await keyword inside here. So we'll just use the fetch API here to actually get our image data from the API. So the API is actually running on localhost 3000. Should have mentioned actually in package.json of this project, you've got two scripts. First of all is to serve the API. So if you just run npm run serve :API, it should get that running for you, and it'll be running on port 3000. And then npm run serve :app will actually set the app running, and that's running on port 3010. Okay, so let's go back to our retrieve images function. So once we've got the actual, let's finish the endpoint off there. So it's images, as you saw in Postman, that's the endpoint that we want to connect to. And then when we get the image data, let's just get the JSON response from the fetch request. And we should probably wrap this in a try and catch block, just in case there are any problems. So catch error, and we won't do anything, shouldn't get any errors, so we'll just console.log the error if it does occur. Okay, so we've got this function where it's retrieving the image data, but we actually want to store it in the app in some state as well, so let's set up some state. So we'll call it just images, and the setter for that is set images, and we're going to use state, and just initialize that with an empty array. Okay, so when we've got that image data, what we can do is say set images and just pass in the image data. And that literally will just be that array that we saw in Postman before, which is this here. So you've got an array and it's just objects with ID and upvotes as the properties. Okay, so we want to trigger this retrieve images function when the app loads. So we'll use a use effect hook. To trigger it just once, we pass in no dependencies. So it will trigger once, but it won't update again. So let's retrieve images. And if we save that now, if we just open up our DevTools, and then just refresh the page, you should see when the page loads that we're making that call to the images endpoint, and we should see all of our data in here, which is exactly what we had in Postman a moment ago. Okay, so that's excellent. We've got the image data and it should be saved in this images state within our actual app, so that's all good. So we can start making some use of that to actually display our images on the page. So to do that, I'm going to create a separate image component and also an image container to contain that image. So let's create those components now. So image container.js, and we'll also create image.js. Okay, so for the image container to start off with, we're going to create it as a function. And we'll do the same thing in image as well. Okay, and we'll actually fill out the image component first. This is going to actually display the actual image on the page. And you're probably wondering where those images actually came from, because we're not storing anything in the database other than a number, an ID. And if we go over to this site called Lorem Pixum or pixum.photos, they provide a kind of API where you can actually put placeholder images in, and that's basically where the images are coming from. So as you can see, all you need to do is construct a URL where you've got the pixum.photos web address, then you specify an ID, and then you can also specify a height and width. So it makes sense for our image component to take in some information to construct that URL. So the props that we'll have passed down will be the ID, the width, and the height. And that just makes this image component a little bit more customizable, but we'll need all that information to actually generate the URL. So the URL for the image, as you can see, will be HTTPS, and then it's pixum.photos /ID, and then we specify the ID, which has been passed in as a prop, and we'll also have custom width and height. Okay, so that basically will construct a URL which is very similar to this, and it will get the specific image that we're looking for. So when we're actually just rendering some content here, we just return some JSX, and we'll have a single div, and we'll give it a class name of image. And the image URL, or rather the source, will be set as the URL. Okay, so let's save that now. We won't see anything on the page as of yet because we haven't made use of this image component, and we're going to make use of it inside of the image container. So what information is this image container component going to need? Well, we're going to need the ID because we're going to be passing that down to the image component we just created, but we'll also need to get the upvotes data for each particular image that's been returned from the API. And in fact, that's the only data that we have in the API, so we're just going to pass all of that down into the image container. Okay, so with that in mind, what I'm going to do here is just set a constant width and height for each of the images. So if obviously we were making a bit more of a complex app, we could have this as a setting somewhere, and the images are reused, and there could be different width and heights if we would like them to be. And let's render some content now. So I'm going to return some JSX here. Just have a class name of image container, and we're just going to make use of one of those image components here. So just import image from the image file, and of course we need to pass in those props. So the ID will be ID, and the width will be equal to the width we've set locally here, and same thing for the height as well. So that should have all of the information it needs to render one of those images now, but we also need to put the upvoting in there as well. So let's put a p tag here, give it a class name of upvotes, for example. And we're going to have two components inside of there essentially, which is the thumb. So let's give that a class of thumb, and let me just grab the I just basically use the thumb emoji just to cheat a little bit here, so rather than using any images or anything like that. And then we also just want to display the upvotes that have been passed in as well. Okay, and that's all the content that we need to display the image container and indeed the image inside that as well. So all we need to do now to actually render these to the page is go back to our app.js file, and underneath the heading, this is where we're going to display the image list. So we'll put those inside a div and give that div a class. Just call it image list, for example. So first of all, check if the state of images has got anything in there. Probably should say if the length is truthy. And if that is the case, then what we want to do is images.map. And inside there, we'll just destructure the ID and upvotes from each of the items that has been returned from the API. And what are we going to be mapping that to? Well, essentially, it's just going to be the JSX for the image container. For each item that's been returned in the array, we will render an image container. So the key for that, because we've got multiple here, will be the ID, and the ID itself will be the ID, and upvotes will be equal to upvotes. Okay, and I think I've broken something here because the page has gone blank. I think probably it is because, yes, okay. So with this current setup, we need to import React into each of these files themselves. Sometimes if you've got a create React app, for example, set up, it's not necessary. But for my setup, we do need to put that in. So let's just pop that into the image container and the image component. Okay, so that's fixed that. So now we've got the images displaying, and you can see already we've got the upvotes because the data in the database still has persisted from when we had the completed app. Okay, so that's one part of the puzzle done. So we've got the images displaying, and we've also got the upvotes being shown as well. So that's corresponding to each image. So the second part of the problem is to actually get the functionality to send the second network request to actually patch the database to update the upvotes property when someone clicks on one of the images. So if you followed any React tutorials before, you'll probably know we just need to set up an onClick event, and when the user clicks the image, it sends a second network request, a bit like we have done here with retrieve images. But in this example, because we've got the images and the kind of functionality here nested in a component, the easiest option is to create that function inside of the image container component. So let's go ahead and do that now. So if we go to the image container component, let's create a new function in here called upvote image, and it's going to look pretty much identical to the retrieve images function. We'll make it async. We'll put this in a try catch block. The only difference this time is I'm not going to actually worry about whether the request got a good response back or not. We should obviously really do some error checking and see if the API responded to say that it actually did work okay. But I'm just going to call the upvote endpoint and then put in the ID that we want to upvote. This will actually just send a GET request by default with fetch, so we actually just need to pass in a second argument as an object with a property of method, and we want to set the verb to patch. Okay, so then in our image container down here, what we want to do in the markup, we want to say when the user clicks on this, what do we want to do? We want to upvote the image. Okay, so let's save that. So this should actually work now. So if I actually click on the image and let's click it once just to be sure. Let's just click it once just to check the value that comes up. But you'll notice the upvotes doesn't actually update automatically, but if we refresh the page, you should see that's now moved up to 10. So if we just click it a couple more times and then refresh the page, you can see that it is being incremented. So the API is working, and this particular upvote image function is working, but we're just not getting the update in real time. So how do we go about solving that? How do we actually get the upvotes to update when we click one of the images? Well, because we're actually calling this function inside of a child component, the image container component, we actually need to notify the top level component, which is in this case the app component, that the state has actually changed. So we do that by passing a function into one of the props of the image container, and then we can then call that function when the actual state updates. So let me explain what I mean by that. Let's go back to the image container component, and we're going to accept a new prop on there just called onUpvote. So this will be another value that's passed into the image container, but this will actually be a function. So when the network request has finished here, we can just call that onUpvote function. Okay, so if we did that at the moment, we'd probably get an error, but essentially when we click on one of the images, the network request will fire and this function will be called, which is actually a function that's been passed in from app.js. So here, when we're using our image container component, we say onUpvote, and we can pass in a function here. So we could do various things. We could actually access the image data that's been set from the initial network request, find the ID for this particular image, and then update its upvotes by 1. But depending on how you've got your app set up, it might cause some problems, because what happens if the network request didn't actually complete and it failed and this upvote didn't get registered? You'd be updating the state locally within the app, but the state or the data in the database will be out of sync. It'll actually not have registered that upvote. So another approach is, instead of actually modifying the state locally here, we could just call this retrieve images function again, which will send another network request to get all of the image data from the database and then in turn update our state for us. So I'm going to do that in this tutorial. So now back over in the app, if I actually click on the image to upvote it, you can see that automatically the upvotes get updated in the app. And if you just look in the network tab here, if we actually click on the image, you can see first of all we've got the patch request to upvote the image, and then we get a second request to reload all of the image data. So you might not want to use this approach if the call to images is expensive, so if it takes a lot of resources or it returns a lot of data, or if there's some other reason why you don't want to do that. But generally it's a good technique to refresh the data from the database each time, because then you can be sure that the data that the user is looking at is representative of what's stored and what other users will be seeing as well. Okay, so that is pretty much all of the functionality done for our image voting. I'm just going to add a bit of styling just so it appears like it did in the original app. Okay, so I'm going to create a couple of SCSS files here. So we'll have one for image.scss, so corresponding to each component, and image container.scss. So let's start off with that one. I think that has the most work to do in here. So we had a class of image container, and we'll just set the cursor to pointer so it looks like you can click on the whole image. I'm going to transition its transform properties by 0.5 seconds. And of course, when you hover over it, we're just going to transform the whole image container just by scaling it just by an ever so slight amount. And of course we've got the thumb in there as well, and we're just going to transform that by rotating it by -45 degrees. Okay, and the other thing we've got in here as well is the upvotes themselves. So the font size is 24 pixels, just make it a little bit bigger to read, and the thumb, we're going to say the margin right, just give it 12 pixels. Display is inline block, and again we'll just transition that on the transform property. Oops, don't need that colon there. Okay, so let's go to the image.scss file, and we just want to target each image here. And we know the width and height is 400 pixels, so I'm just going to set that statically here, and just a bit of box shadow as well. Make sure I've got all my zeros there. And so let's just import those into app.css. Okay, so that padding and everything is being applied there, and we've got the transitions on the images. So just within the app itself, let's just make all of those images appear side by side. So the image list is just display flex, flex wrap is wrap, and justify content space between. Okay, so now our images are appearing in a list, and just to finish off, the heading level 1 tag, which is the title, give it a largish font size, and a bit of padding, and a border on the bottom. We'll just give that a slight grey colour with a bit of opacity. Okay, so there we have it. That is our completed app. Let's just try it out one more time. So we've got our transitions, and if we just click on some of the images, you can see the upvotes are being registered. If we refresh the page, they're still there. And again, that'll be the same as any user visiting the page. They'll be able to get the same number of upvotes because that's coming from the database. So that's it for this tutorial. Hopefully you've learned a couple of things about using network requests to actually retrieve and update data that's stored in a database via its API. I'm breaking down those components and making sure we can call those network requests at the right level. And then finally we took a look at how to actually pass a function down as a prop so that that function can be called from a parent component within its child component. So as always, thanks very much for watching, and if you have a second before you leave, don't forget to subscribe to support the channel, and I'll see you next time.